Picture the place you call home. It's a beautiful world, and it's right here. It's a beautiful world, and it's right here. Underneath your nose, just breathe in and take it all. There is one thing you should know. It's a beautiful world.
Today, when you fly into the Caribbean from Europe or America, your first contact is with a functional air terminal with standardized, interchangeable infrastructure. Modern commercial aviation has more or less abolished space, time, and difference. Some people even wonder whether the islands haven't lost a bit of their soul. But anyway, the waters are still turquoise and the temperatures are just as balmy. For these islands that live essentially from tourism, the aeroplane is a gift from heaven. Practically all the inhabited islands of the Caribbean now have a landing strip. There are runways everywhere, and it now seems quite normal. The fact that some of these runways exist is thanks to a few intrepid aviators, true pioneers, who were determined to set down their plane anywhere, even in the most unlikely places.
Relax, let go. Live each day and have a blast. Live it like it was your last.
In all the islands, the runway has become the equivalent of the main highway, the favorite link between the island and the outside world. The airport has become a vital hub of activity, an economic, political, and diplomatic center, symbol of the reduction of time and space. Where once journeys were measured in days, they are now measured in hours. The air terminal itself has become a meeting place with a very important social function.
I know myself that when I want to see people I haven't seen for a long time, I go to the airport, and almost every time I bump into people I haven't seen for 10 or 15 years.
It means we can keep up the links between the inhabitants. Of course, there are those accompanying people who are leaving, others waiting for family who are arriving, and it's an obligatory meeting place precisely for maintaining that social contact that's essential for the population.
The coming of the plane really transformed the way of life and also the physical shape of some islands.
The coming of the plane kick-started the modern economy of all our small islands.
I think it has done a lot for us because not only for getting around but also for tradespeople and the sick in the old days, because we didn't have all these doctors and all that. The opening up of the air routes also obviously helps the development of tourism and also helped the people of Barths to discover the outside world more easily.
The small islands of the Caribbean had very few natural resources. Barths had practically none. A former hideout for buccaneers and pirates, the island was poor until the aeroplane changed its destiny by bringing in the first wealthy tourists. "7,000 kilometers away from Europe, Caribbean airspace has always been, since the birth of aviation, one of the busiest on the planet in relation to its population. In fact, the Antilles Arc is a natural crossing point between Europe and Latin America, but even more so between North and South America. Before the aeroplane, the way of life in the Lesser Antilles hadn't changed in a very long time. After the Second World War, on St. Barths as elsewhere, the main activity was to ensure survival, and traditional values occupied a dominant place. Communication with the outside had to be by sea.
It was very badly served. Exchanges between islands were not very frequent. There was practically nothing. There were the schooners.
Before, we had to depend on the sailing boat to start with, then the motorboat, because St. Barths had about 30 schooners.
A small fleet of schooners had for a long time been based on St. Barths. Thanks to its free port status, to help make up for its lack of natural resources, the island had built up its maritime trade.
The St. Barths are very surprising. There were a lot of sailors, very good sailors in fact.
A schooner could carry up to 100 tons of goods. Romainville has plied the Caribbean Sea with his own schooner for nearly 30 years.
In the old days, I'd leave here in the schooner to take goods to Guadeloupe or Martinique. It varied. I'd go off with a load of salt that I'd picked up at Céline, and on the deck I put 60 head of cattle.
Cattle breeding and salt production were two of the main activities in St. Barths. But you still had to manage the transport. Cattle are not always good sailors, and sea crossings by schooner were always unpredictable.
It was the only means of communication. All depended on the wind. It took 24 hours from here to Guadeloupe, and sometimes 2 or 3 days if there was no wind.
But when there was a dead calm or a headwind, the crossing could take us 10 days in one direction or the other.
From Guadeloupe to St. Barth, it could easily take 2 or 3 weeks if there was no wind.
Yes, the Caribbean islands were very isolated, and the French West Indies seemed very remote from mainland France. 1946, the French government decided to create a transatlantic air route with a stopover in Port-Étienne in Mauritania. Its aim? To link up metropolitan France to Martinique and Guadeloupe, two islands that had just been granted the status of overseas departments. In the Caribbean, many had already dreamed of seeing planes in the Antillean sky. In 1922, the first aircraft reached Fort-de-France from the American continent. It was an American Navy flying boat. In those days, the flying boat seemed to be the ideal way of crossing the Atlantic, and the government placed an order for a giant aircraft. The La Tecoère 631. 3 of them were given to the national airline.
Air France opened its transatlantic services between France and Martinique in 1947.
Between Biscarrosse, a lake that lies to the south of Bordeaux, and Fort-de-France.
At the time, there was no airfield.
This flying boat, considered to be the biggest in the world, with its 6 engines, a weight of 76 tons, and a wingspan of 56 meters, could carry up to 50 passengers.
It was a beautiful plane. A beautiful plane, and its characteristics required extraordinary maintenance.
With its comfort and its cabins, this enormous flying boat was designed like a liner, a flying ship.
The inside furnishing for its wealthy passengers was, of course, very luxurious. And it offered the very first service of meals on board.
The The passengers were brought from Paris to the Lake of Biscarrosse near Bordeaux by train and bus. After a journey of about 32 hours, 26 of which were in the air, they touched down in the Bay of Fort-de-France. At that time, ocean voyages between metropolitan France and the Antilles were rare, and the crossing took at least 6 days. The giant flying boat began a regular service with a return journey every 2 weeks. But passengers needed to be able to continue their onward journey from Fort-de-France to other islands.
From there, passengers who had to go north or south were taken aboard amphibious planes that could come down on airfields, runways, or on water. Those planes were Catalinas.
From Fort-de-France, 3 Catalinas flew to Guadeloupe, Saint-Martin, Guyana, and other destinations, although the Caribbean skies had been until then the private reserve of the Americans. With the lack of landing strips, air travel between the islands could only be carried out by seaplanes. After the war, there were very few landing strips in the Lesser Antilles. Indeed, the very idea of building runways on some of these islands seemed just like a wild dream. Fortunately, a few bold aviators believed in the idea. Some of them became figureheads for all the pilots in the region. For example, José Dormoy.
Well, I have a deep admiration for Dormoy. At the age of 16 or 17, he quit his family life in Guadeloupe, and he went off to join de Gaulle's Free French Forces. And then he became a fighter pilot in the RAF.
José Dormoy left his mark in the Antilles under the nickname of Mr. Pipe, because he always had his pipe in his mouth, even when he was flying his plane. Dormoy was very well acquainted with another legendary character, sailor, adventurer, and visionary, Rémy de Hénin, the first to have the idea of landing a plane on St. Barths.
He was living in Puerto Rico. He learned to fly. He bought a small plane, and then, on the only place possible on St. Barths, where the runway is now, and with the permission of Mr. Eddy, who owned all this land, de Hénin came in his little plane, and he landed.
And before long, de Hénin was landing regularly in twin-engine planes between the hill and the sea, which runs along the edge of the Saint-Jean airfield.
Very few people believed it would happen, but he did, as he did in many things, and he did it.
So they laughed at him and said, "Oh, the poor guy, if he carries on like that, he'll kill himself on St. Barths."
Not only did de Hénin not kill himself, but it didn't take him long to convince the inhabitants and visitors of the importance of aviation.
I landed, and everything worked out fine. I'd like to pay a tribute to the owner, Mr. Eddy, who then cooperated by cutting down trees and filling on the lake. The landing strip wasn't recognized by the authorities until 10 or 12 years later.
There were already electric cables and telephone wires that went across there, and he landed anyway. He just went under them.
This land was a pasture where my father kept his cattle, goats, and sheep.
In the family house which sits alongside the runway, Hippolyte Lédé, one of the first pilots, thinks back.
We came in quite low so that the herdsman could see us, and he knew straight away that we wanted to land.
There was someone looking after the sheep for Mr. Lédé, and who, when the plane went over, had a box with pebbles in, and he rattled the pebbles in the box to chase off the sheep so that Mr. de Hénin could land.
The small aerodrome at St. Barths gradually developed, and even the schooner captains began to travel by plane.
From the moment the plane arrived, everything changed.
Yes, the Saint-Jean Aerodrome quickly became one of the busiest places on the island. The number of people wishing to travel by plane rather than by boat kept on growing. The demand had to be met, a system created, an airline company set up. Tintamarre, a small deserted island off Saint-Martin. No high ground, the ideal place for an adventurer like de NN to create an airbase.
The island's flat, so you didn't have to do much to make a landing strip.
I chose Tintamarre because it's a French territory, and the only runway in the region at that time was the Juliana Aerodrome built by the Dutch during the war, and the island was flat. In fact, the English people living in the region call it Flat Island. I simply went with a boat, with the crew, and in one day, we pulled up a few plants that were too big, filled in some of the crab holes, because there were a lot of them, and then I landed, and we set up there. That's how we decided to create a little company that provided a service to the islands like St. Barths, St. Martin, and Guadeloupe, where there were no aerodromes. There were none anywhere.
The CAA, the Antillais Air Company.
There was a runway a few hundred meters long. Every time we landed or took off, it was an exploit. We were never sure we'd make it.
In 1946, it wasn't hard to find planes if you weren't too fussy about their condition.
He bought them in Puerto Rico. He had them brought from the States. The planes weren't expensive. They were wrecked because they were rotting in hangars, so it was minimum investment with a vast number of spare parts.
We had about 5 or 6 planes. They were American war surplus, among which there were 2 seaplanes and 4 planes.
The planes they used at the time were 4-seaters, 5-seaters. They were really small planes. There were never any big planes. So carrying people, well, it was just a question of 2, 3, or 4 people, that's all.
I think the passengers must have been scared quite often, because at the beginning they were in old planes, just scrapped from the war. And that meant it was really hard work, but we did it anyway.
From Tintamarre, they went all over the Antilles in difficult conditions.
And he did almost a regular service between Saint-Martin and Guadeloupe.
The pilots and mechanics lived between Tintamarre and Saint-Martin. One of these pilots, Roger Ganthaume, was engaged to Andrea Peterson.
And the pilots arrived. They'd all left home as students, you know, at 18 or 20. They came back, and there was really nothing to do. And all they could dream about, I suppose, was flying.
They were certainly keen, and some of them came from Martinique. There was one called Ganthaume, another called Zouzou, who were both pilots trained in the Air Force in England.
Everyone dreamed about it in those days. Flying was something wonderful. A pilot was almost a hero, you see.
But even a hero has to earn a living, and while the Tintamarre pilots carried mainly passengers by day, by night they would sometimes be transporting different goods.
We were often contacted by people in Guadeloupe who asked us to bring back whiskey because in Guadeloupe whiskey was very expensive. In St. Barths it didn't cost much. American cigarettes too. So we often finished up doing night flights loaded with cigarettes and whiskey.
They bought cinnamon, nutmeg, and vanilla here. They'd sell it, I think, either in Saint-Martin or St. Barths.
They'd leave Tintamarre at about 2 or 3 in the morning with nothing. There were no lights or anything. They arrived at Saint-Félix in Gosier, and the people lit their way with flaming torches. They'd been alerted. They unloaded their merchandise and then came back and landed at Tintamarre at sunrise, about 6 or 6:30 in the morning.
If Rémy de NN set up his company on a desert isle, it was so as not to have too much explaining to do to the authorities. But he did come up against other difficulties.
The company went well for a year, and then there were 2 accidents, unfortunately.
They were all very nice young men, and we were devastated to learn how they died. It was so stupid.
There was a first accident with Gantom on his own. Then I went off to Paris, and while I was away, the pilots were, well, careless. One of them took a plane that shouldn't have flown, and as soon as there's an accident, obviously the administration is reluctant to grant authorization. So I had to stop everything.
CAA didn't survive the 2 accidents, but in the meantime, a number of aeronautical projects had got underway. In Guadeloupe, they decided to build a runway not far from Pointe-à-Pitre, and it was José Dormoy who, after being part of the adventure in Tintamarre, helped to open the Le Rézé runway. The 1,600-meter concrete runway came into service in 1950. In Martinique, Le Lamentin airport came into service in 1952. After Le Rézé in Guadeloupe, José Dormoy opened other runways.
I remember in Marie-Galante, the first time we were there, I landed on the football pitch, and I was afraid I wouldn't be able to take off, and after 2 or 3 times, as we only had a little flying club plane that only took 1 passenger plus the pilot, I persuaded all the people there to advance me a bit of money, and I bought a bigger 4-seater plane. And that's how I started to create the Marie-Galante route, and then the same for Désirade. We decided to create an airstrip there, so the doctor and his patients and a few volunteers from the village set to work, and they cut down the manchineel trees. There were loads of trees. They cut them down, filled in the holes, and that's how the Désirade runway started.
Despite the difficulties presented by their small surface area or the hilly terrain, runways gradually opened up over practically all of the inhabited islands. One of them, Saba, was just a great rock, and the local authorities decided to call on the most intrepid pilot in the region.
God's gift to Saba was the lava flow which created the flat point. And Mr. Rémy de Hanan, who was an adventurer with aviation in the islands, he flew around Saba and he saw the possibility of building an airstrip.
February 1959. After coming to inspect the island in a seaplane, de NN had the little piece of flat land cleared and, watched by an ecstatic population, managed to land his little single-engined plane. In 1961, other pioneers created Winwood, the first company to serve Saba. Some came from St. Barths. They developed a network that covered all the Dutch islands and beyond.
To survive, the company had to use other pilots, and that's how José finally came to work for Winwood. he stayed. He's the pilot who stayed with us the longest, and he really was an incredible guy.
Yes, after a stay in Guyana whose main object was getting supplies to the gold panners in the most remote places, Mr. Pipe brought his experience to the service of this small company. He became the official pilot of the Dutch royal family when they were visiting islands associated with the kingdom. The runway at Sabah is more like an aircraft carrier than an airport. In fact, at the beginning, some pilots refused to land there. Dormoy landed there thousands of times, with no problems. And they say he never aborted a landing, whatever the weather. The creation of runways on the small islands speeded up time, and the aeroplane became a commonplace means of transport. Too commonplace, perhaps.
Here, there are 2,000 inhabitants. They had never left their island except by boat. It was an expedition. Now it's common. A Twin Otter arrives, 20 people get on. Everyone finds that normal.
And it made a major change in the island's economy and the mentality of our people traveling abroad and so on. I don't know of any other single investment on the island that made such a major change as the airport.
For the people of Marie-Galante, it was a blessing from God.
Isolated for so long, these islands realized that, thanks to the aeroplane, they too could be part of the modern world. (1950). 2 years after transatlantic flying boats stopped being used because of accidents, air routes between France and the Antilles started up again with a new aircraft that flew between Paris, New York and Pointe-à-Pitre once a month, the Constellation. It was another 3 years before there were direct flights between Paris and the Antilles.
In 1953, Air France put the Super Constellation into service on the Paris-Orly-Le Rézé non-stop routes.
In the 1960s, the history of aviation gathered momentum. Air routes were developing everywhere, and companies serving the Lesser Antilles multiplied. Pan Am was the first to put jet airliners into service in the Caribbean, and Air France flew a Boeing 707 to the French West Indies in 1960. At this time, tourism was developing rapidly in the Caribbean islands as they basked in a temperature of around 30 degrees all the year long. In the north, the airport of San Juan in Puerto Rico became a hub for Caribbean and Latin American services from the USA and helped to produce a spectacular economic boom. The first Boeing 747 landed in the French West Indies in 1970. Furthering the development of an important tourist industry in Guadeloupe and Martinique. And soon after, the charter companies were launched with their pioneers, both men and women.
SAT was the first French charter company serving the Antilles. Validaire wasn't a French company. It was a completely illegal company.
Yes, it was a woman who launched the first charter company between metropolitan France and the Antilles. And it was another woman who created the first regular company aimed at linking up Guadeloupe and its islands, Nicole Petreluzzi.
She obtained her pilot's license very young, at 17, and with her father she flew the shuttle service on Marie-Galante. She had a very small plane called the Lazy Mosquito, and afterwards she created her fleet especially for Marie-Galante and named her company Air Antilles. We opened up all the services from Guadeloupe without exception. At the beginning, I was the only pilot. Then gradually, as the routes developed, of course we had to bring in pilots from the outside. And that's how I hired the man who became my husband shortly afterwards.
In 1977, 191,401 passengers were carried between Guadeloupe and Marie-Galante. Today, the aerodrome is deserted because the air companies can't compete with the fast boats. The situation is identical in Saintes, where the runway, carved with difficulty out of the island, is now only used by private planes. And yet, to build what is now this ghost aerodrome between the houses and the sea, they had to level one of the rare available pieces of land in Terre-de-Haut, flatten the dunes, and fill in a lake.
So the lake is all that up to about 200 meters away.
That lake was the island's main water source.
We're heading towards La Pointe des Châteaux. We're 1,200 feet up.
Simon Hayot is also one of Guadeloupe's aviation pioneers. He observed the department's development.
When I arrived in Guadeloupe from Martinique in 1976, this runway, this beach, was a white sand beach with coconut palms. The first company I set up was Guadeloupe Air Cargo. I quickly realized there was a real demand for passenger transport because Air Guadeloupe only did regular flights between Marie-Galante, Désirade, Les Saintes, Saint-Barths, Saint-Martin. That's when I got the idea of creating the company Air Caraïbes, first of all with 2 Cessna 207s, and those planes were Air Caraïbes' first planes. They were soon replaced by BN2s, which were twin-engined, 10-seater English planes specially made for Caraïbes. Everyone had them. Liat, all our competitors got them. And we threw ourselves into setting up this company, Air Caraïbes, with all the problems of red tape there were at that time.
With tenacity and a good dose of imagination, you can make a living from air transport in the Caribbean, but to really succeed, it takes a lot of hard work. Simon Hayot began his air operations with an old DC-3, with which he carried passengers who were occasionally rather different.
What helped me to make money quickly was the transport of live animals. I got into transport of racehorses because there was a market for transporting racehorses between the Caribbean islands. Horses were the most dangerous animals to carry, in my opinion, because they're animals that are very lively in a plane. And I had an incident between Barbados and Fort-de-France once. I practically had to put down a horse. He kicked a porthole out and smashed it. I transported a lot of cattle that I also bought in Barbuda, Antigua, and that I sold on in Guadeloupe and between Marie-Galante and Fort-de-France.
Sometimes these outsized passengers would forget to fasten their safety belts.
We took off, and we'd been flying for a quarter of an hour when the ox that was nearest to the front, if you like, just behind me, backed into the cockpit.
Rémy Aulagnier is another old firebrand of the skies. Across the Caribbean, he takes care of the transport of everything that must be carried post-haste from one island to another.
I've carried everything here. People who wanted to be cremated. Well, there's no crematorium either in St. Martin or St. Barths, so for years I carried coffins. I carried the family with the coffin. It was a bit weird.
Little by little, the aeroplane became indispensable to the Antilles, providing services in many areas. It turned out to be very useful, for example, for treating banana plantations.
We spread oil-based products on the bananas, on the banana plantations. That's all there was at the time. There weren't planes that were made to do that, so all the weight was behind the pilot, and if there was a crash, he'd get the whole tank full. Ever since I was small, I wanted to treat the bananas from the air. And that's always been my #1 interest, spraying bananas.
In the 1960s, these aerobatics fascinated the young. Today, spraying is carried out by helicopters.
Here, without planes, the population is completely cut off from the rest of the world.
Anyway, it's either the plane or the boat.
It's the van, the car.
Remember that a second-hand plane is no more expensive than a 4x4 in metropolitan France, so a plane isn't a luxury, it's a necessity.
6 o'clock in the morning, Saint-Barths. For Bernard Javel, too, who works as a cook, the plane is a tool. It allows him to get his supplies of crayfish from Saint-Eustache or Barbuda.
When you take off from Saint-Barths very early in the morning, there's not much air traffic. You just have the exceptional beauty of the world that you're flying through. You're going through clouds tinged with shades of pink and blue. You really feel like an angel going up to heaven.
Barbuda, 7:30 in the morning.
There's a whole period of the year when there are no crayfish on Saint-Barths. And that's when we come and get supplies here. At the start of the season like this, we tend to fly to Guadeloupe and Martinique, who don't, in fact, have any crayfish left, and can't even supply the local market.
Eric Burton was born here. A former boxer, he's a noted crayfish supplier.
We have a lot of reef around. Some of the other country there is deep, water is deep, but Barbuda have nice flat reef all over.
Yes, thanks to a vast coral-covered plateau in shallow water, you find a lot of crayfish here. Once the crayfish are packed up, you just have to pay and take them away. On Saint-Barths, one couple have widened their professional horizons thanks to the aeroplane. Pierre Brouwers is a pilot and Véronique Ridon is an eye specialist.
I'm an ophthalmologist. Part of the time on St. Barths, part of the time on Marie-Galante.
Here we're on Saint-Barths on a small island. We're going to work on Marie-Galante, an island about 350 kilometers from here. We can't swim there. There's no sea or air connection.
Marie-Galante has about 20,000 inhabitants, but to have eye treatment, people have to go to Pointe-à-Pitre.
Because there are not enough patients for an ophthalmologist to make a decent living. There are a lot of old people on Marie-Galante who've never seen an eye specialist. We've now treated 7,500 patients on Marie-Galante.
Saint-Martin is very much bigger than Marie-Galante. When you have your own plane, when you're a pilot and instructor, you can wear several different hats.
I'm also a professional pilot in the local company that operates the air ambulance service from St. Martin. The medical structure here doesn't treat all illnesses, so we regularly take patients to Guadeloupe and Martinique, both day and night.
3 planes fitted out to carry stretcher, medical equipment and support staff are permanently ready to go.
We fly on call from the hospital with takeoff guaranteed in less than 2 hours. We're called on to transport around 200 people a year.
Another of Yves Blanchet's activities is press transportation. When the plane from Paris is late, the newspapers miss the connecting flight for Saint-Barths. And that's where Yves Blanchet and his plane come in. As high performance as they may be, regular local companies cannot supply the personalized service that private airplanes can. However, in the Caribbean there are some very versatile companies, including some that do not own a single aeroplane.
Airline is a virtual airline that operates private charters throughout the islands. We are very specialized in providing shared charters to the different islands from St. Martin.
The company doesn't need to buy planes. It rents them according to the demand. Despite appearances, flying in the West Indies and running an airline company is not as simple as all that. First of all, there are administrative constraints.
Regulations are always 10 to 15 years behind technical progress.
The administration has complicated matters to such an extent and watches so closely that we don't have the freedom we used to have.
Before, you got in the plane and called the tower. You explained the flight plan quite simply by radio.
Freedom in the air is being gradually cut back every day.
You spend more time filling out papers than you do in the air. I have to go to St. Barths, which is 10 minutes away by plane. It'll take me an hour. I have to arrive an hour early at the airport.
Another little worry is a mechanical one, because quite often spare parts are not immediately available. They have to be ordered from the United States. But today, if they're well maintained, aeroplanes rarely break down.
The only major technical problem, in fact, is aerology. You have to really understand the movements of the air, because if you're landing on a strip like Désirade or Les Saintes, as soon as you have a wind, be it a south wind or a north wind, you get into eddies and turbulence.
You really have to take the weather into account, but other natural phenomena can also disturb air navigation. Montserrat. In 1995, the Soufriere Hills volcano erupted and lava spread over much of the island. The airport, along with the capital Plymouth, were covered over by lava, and even today, clouds of ash still disrupt air traffic.
Practically 2/3 of the island's population left, forced to take refuge in Antigua, and many even left for England. This whole area of the island here is now deserted. Nobody lives here anymore.
One of the inhabitants' priorities was to build a new airport in the north of the island. Flying a plane in the West Indies is still a dream, but it's not always easy and can come up with a few surprises. It's not uncommon to see ghost islands.
Ghost islands really do exist. I came across one once between Dominica and Martinique. I saw a ghost island on my left to the west. This means you can see an island somewhere that you know isn't there. So that means it's a ghost.
They are simply shadows the clouds cast on the sea. You never see them when you know the area well because you don't fall for it. But a young pilot, looking for the island in front of him, who suddenly sees it to one side, will think that's the one he's looking for.
The trickiest thing for a pilot in the Caribbean to do is still to touch down gently on airstrips like Saba, Les Saintes, Moustique, or Saint-Barths.
This is a landing that's tricky. It's one of the more difficult.
But when you know it and you're landing with a head or a tailwind, and when you know what you're doing, it goes very well. It takes experience.
To land on these unusual airstrips, pilots have to have special qualifications.
It hasn't been simple, but civil aviation authorities have played along, classifying these as restricted usage areas and subjecting all pilots to a local qualification. That is still in force.
Dude, that guy's got to stop. Whoa! Crap.
While the qualification may reduce risks, it does not eliminate them completely. But accidents can occur anywhere, and not necessarily where you might expect them. Flight navigation instruments have evolved a great deal. Today, they're an important safety factor. In the days of the pioneers, they didn't even exist.
It used to be called flying by the seat of your pants, because all you had to navigate by was a compass and a watch.
It's easier today than it was then, a lot easier. Today, we are fortunate because the equipment has evolved a lot, as in all fields, whereas for the real pioneers like Rémy de Haenen or José Dormoy, it was another world.
We flew without radios, without flight plans, without knowing, without having checked weather reports. We had no communications whatsoever with neighboring islands. We made estimations according to speed, according to the wind. We used dead reckoning, allowing for drift. We took off, then prayed all would go well.
We never got lost, in fact.
No, we never got lost.
Today, the shadow of these pioneers is still present in the Caribbean, as tribute is paid to their spirit. José Dormoy lived for a long time on the island of Saint-Eustache. In the little air terminal, Ellie, his widow, contributed to a little exhibition to the memory of these aviation pioneers. The idea was to commemorate the exploits of these legendary aviators and to see just how much they contributed to the development of these islands. In Saint-Martin, the Dutch Postal Service issued a collection of stamps with the images of these great pilots. And on Saint-Barths in 2004, an important award was given to Mr. Pipe.
Mr. José Dormoy, in the name of the Republic, we present you with the Aeronautical Medal.
I would also like to thank Rémy, who is here. This reminds me of the good old days. Thanks, Rémy.
There you are, there's no more room.
Large numbers of both island people and public officials attended Rémy de Haenen's funeral to pay homage to the visionary pilot.
I would like to pay a last tribute to Mr. Rémy de Haenen, former mayor and member of the General Council of Saint-Barths.
They must have loved it. They were, in fact, sort of adventurers. Yes, that's obvious. I think they were certainly the greatest pilots in the West Indies.
I think all young pilots must feel inspired by those men.
There are no solutions in life. There are forces at work. You have to create them, and the solutions will follow. Antoine de Saint-Exupéry.
It's time to start over again. Look out for some clover again. I'll have to start yoga or zen. I'm going to smile when I wake up. Get out of my lazy bed. I finally figured it out. And now I know what it's about. I'll open the shutters and shout until the town settle down. 'Cause he's out of my crazy head. He's gone away. The man is gone and I'm alone. But I moved on. He's gone. So dump the man quickly as you can. Leave the frying pan. It's time to start over again.